The dirt was the color of rust, and it was the first thing the boy knew. It was the dirt of a one-room log cabin in Kentucky, packed down hard by bare feet and poverty. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and hard work. This was the world of Abraham Lincoln's youth, a world defined not by what one could become, but by the sheer, unyielding effort of survival. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a stern, restless man who moved his family from Kentucky to the raw wilderness of Indiana, chasing land titles and a sliver of better fortune. What they found was more hardship. Young Abe grew tall and gangly, his muscles forged by the axe and the plow. He split enough rails to fence a continent, his hands becoming rough and powerful, yet they itched for something other than the smooth, worn handle of an axe. His formal schooling was a ghost of an education, less than a year in scattered, fleeting sessions. But in that, he found his first quiet rebellion against his circumstances. He devoured every book he could borrow, walking miles for a new volume. He read Aesop's fables, Robinson Crusoe, and the Bible, and he read them by the flickering light of the fireplace after long days of physical labor. Words became his escape and his weapon. He began to see that the world was wider than the forest clearing, that history and law and philosophy existed, and that a man was not irrevocably chained to the soil his father tilled. This hunger for knowledge created a subtle, but profound, rift with his father, who saw such bookishness as laziness. When his mother, the gentle Nancy Hanks, died of milk sickness, a profound loneliness settled into him, a melancholy that would become a familiar companion throughout his life. The boy of the frontier was being tempered, his body hardened by labor, his mind sharpened by words, and his spirit acquainted with loss. The young man who eventually left his father's household and floated down the Sangamon River to New Salem, Illinois, was a raw specimen. He was a store clerk, a postmaster, a surveyor. He was the kind of man who would wrestle the local bully to a draw for the respect of the town, but also the one who would meticulously correct his own grammar and arithmetic. It was here he faced his first great personal failures. He went into business with a partner. The venture collapsed, leaving him saddled with a debt so large it would take him years to pay it off. He called it the national debt. He courted in Rutledge, and her sudden death from typhoid fever plunged him into a depression so deep his friends feared for his sanity. This was his first prison, not one of iron bars, but of circumstance, debt, and a grief that seemed to confirm his deepest fears of unworthiness. Yet, just as in the story of Leo Vance, a different kind of conflict pushed him onto a new path. The Black Hawk War of 1832 was a minor, brutal conflict, but for Lincoln, it was a crucible. He was elected captain of his militia company, an experience that, despite the lack of major combat, gave him his first taste of leadership and the respect of his peers. Returning to New Salem, he lost his first bid for the state legislature. It was another failure, but the fire of political ambition was now lit. He ran again and won, serving several terms in the Illinois General Assembly. He taught himself law, spending every spare moment with borrowed law books, and became a licensed attorney. The man who moved to the new state capital of Springfield was no longer the backwoods rail splitter. He was Mr. Lincoln, a promising lawyer with a reputation for honesty, a formidable courtroom presence, and a deep, logical mind. This was his second life, the rise of the politician and the prairie lawyer. He married Mary Todd, a woman of ambition and social standing from a prominent Kentucky family. a union that was both a personal triumph and a source of immense domestic complexity. He built a successful law practice, riding the circuit across Illinois, arguing cases from land disputes to murder trials. His fame grew, not just for his legal acumen, but for his wit, his storytelling, and his profound, innate humanity. He served a single term in the U.S. House of Representatives, where he opposed the Mexican-American War, a principled but politically unpopular stand that stalled his national career. He seemed, for a time, to have settled into the role of a respected state-level figure, his national ambitions a dormant dream. But the issue that had always simmered in the background of his conscience was about to boil over and would demand a third and greater transformation. The passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, which allowed for the expansion of slavery into new territories, ignited a fire in him. It was a moral wrong. He believed a betrayal of the nation's founding principle that all men are created equal. He re-entered politics with a new and powerful voice. The famous Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858, though he lost the Senate race to Stephen A. Douglas, catapulted him onto the national stage. His arguments against the expansion of slavery were not the fiery rhetoric of an abolitionist, but the cool, logical, and profoundly moral reasoning of a man who believed slavery was a cancer that would destroy the Union from within. He was not yet calling for its end where it existed, but he insisted it must be placed on a path to ultimate extinction. In 1860, this gangly, self-educated lawyer from the West, with a high, reedy voice and a face he himself called homely, was elected the 16th President of the United States. It was his greatest triumph, and it immediately became his greatest nightmare. Within weeks, South Carolina seceded from the Union, followed by 6 other states. By the time he arrived in Washington for his inauguration, the nation was fracturing. The war that he had hoped to avoid began at Fort Sumter. Abraham Lincoln, the man of words and law, was now a war president. This was his third and most terrible life. The wartime leader, the emancipator. The early years of the Civil War were a relentless parade of defeat, incompetence, and personal anguish for Lincoln. He cycled through generals, McDowell, McClellan, Pope, Burnside, Hooker, desperate to find one who would fight. He was mocked by the press, attacked by politicians in the North who thought him a tyrant, and by copperheads who wanted peace at any price. The death of his beloved son, Willie, in 1862, nearly broke him, adding an almost unbearable weight of personal sorrow to the colossal burden of the war. Mary Lincoln's grief spiraled into a profound instability, leaving him often alone in the cavernous White House. But in this furnace of suffering, his vision clarified. He understood that the war had to be transformed. It could not merely be a war to preserve the Union. It had to become a war for freedom, a war to give the nation, as he would later say, a new birth of freedom. Against all political advice, he drafted the Emancipation Proclamation. It was a military measure, limited in its immediate legal scope, but it changed everything. It transformed the war's purpose and invited black soldiers to fight for their own liberty, adding a crucial moral and physical force to the Union cause. The passage of the 13th Amendment, which he tirelessly lobbied for, would make that emancipation permanent and universal. His leadership evolved from that of a cautious politician to that of a profound statesman and a national pastor. His speeches, particularly the Gettysburg Address and his second inaugural address, became sacred American scripture. At Gettysburg, He redefined the war as a test of whether a nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, can long endure. In his second inaugural, with the war's end in sight, he spoke not of triumph, but of shared sin and a shared duty to bind up the nation's wounds with malice toward none, with charity for all. He had become the redeemer, not just of the Union, but of its soul. On April 9th, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was effectively over. 5 days later, while watching a play at Ford's Theater, Abraham Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth. He died the following morning. The man who had risen from the dirt to preserve the Union and free 4 million people was gone, martyred at the very moment of his hard-won victory. His story is the ultimate American transformation, from the obscurity of the frontier to the pinnacle of power, from a man haunted by failure to a leader who bore the failure of a nation and guided it toward redemption. From a boy who learned to read by firelight to a president who wrote some of the most enduring words in the English language. He was the rail splitter, the lawyer, the emancipator, a man who lived 3 distinct lives, each one preparing him for the next, until he became the figure necessary to save the Union and, in doing so, redefine the very meaning of America. His greatness was not born of ease, but forged in the darkest of fires, a testament that the most profound strength can be found in the most unlikely of places.